Hello everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. Shenhe is finally here, and thus I've spent the past few hours battling my way through Economia and fighting the new Bishop bosses, all so that I could level up Shenhe up to level 90 so I could give her a proper review. A lot of players are actually still on the fence on whether or not they want to summon for Shenhe, largely due to the fact that she has such a hyper-specific kit, and many players are wondering whether or not they should use their valuable primos on a dedicated cryo support unit. So today we're going to be seeing just how viable Shenhe actually is and how much of a damage boost she can actually give your cryo characters. Is it significant enough to make her worth it, or is she just an easy skip? Through the entire video, my Shenhe will be at C0. She will be using her signature weapon at R1, so this should give you a pretty good idea of what a well-invested C0 Shenhe can do. If you do end up enjoying the video, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. I'd greatly appreciate it, and it does help me boost into the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. Okay, but with all that out of the way, let's get into the review. Alright, I'm gonna be completely honest. When you look at Shenhe's kit, it looks like you're reading a Yu-Gi-Oh card, but I promise you it's actually a lot simpler than it seems. Essentially all that you really need to know is that Shenhe's skill increases her own and her party members' cryo damage, and it does so based off of Shenhe's overall attack. You can only deal increased cryo damage up to 5 to 7 times, and when you hit enemies or multiple enemies it will consume these stacks. Additionally, when you do unlock her second passive, when you press her skill, all active party members will be getting a 15% boost to their skill and burst damage, and alternatively if you hold her skill, then all active party members will get a 15% damage boost to their normal attack, charge attack, and plunging damage. And as for her burst, it periodically inflicts cryo, reduces enemies' resistance to cryo and physical damage, and when you unlock her first passive, you also get an additional 15% cryo bonus damage. And honestly, that's about it. Like I said, it looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. However, that being said, although it is a simple concept, that doesn't actually mean that it's easy to pull off in the heat of battle. The main thing that I learned about Shenhe is that it's all about managing your skill cooldowns, your burst uptime, and your rotations. It really does take a little while to get a hang of it, but once you do, it starts to become a little more intuitive, and the damage numbers start to speak for themselves. But before we get into actual specific examples, let's quickly go over my Shenhe build just so that we're all on the same page. My Shenhe currently has 3,803 attack, 65 elemental mastery, 42.7% crit rate, 133.9% crit damage, only 115% energy recharge. This is actually really low, guys. If you can get her above 130 energy recharge, I highly recommend it. And honestly, even anywhere between 150 and 180 is probably ideal. I make up for my bad ER mainly with my other teammates, so this is definitely something to keep in mind. And as for elemental bonus damage, I have 12 across the board due to the passive of her weapon. And speaking of her weapon, I am using the Calamity Queller, which has an insanely high base attack, an attack percent substat, a 12% all elemental bonus damage, and additional attack percent stacking when she does use her elemental skill, and this attack percent stacking can be doubled when she's off the field. As for her artifact set, since I'm mainly using her as a support unit, I'm using a 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Shimenao's Reminiscence. This way my Shenhe gets an additional 36% attack. And as for my main stats, her Sand, Goblet, and Circlet are all attack percent. This isn't really ideal for her own damage output, but it does help boost her skill buff, and therefore it's much more important to this build. As for constellations, like I said, she's C0 and she's going to be C0 the entire video. And as for her talent, she's currently sitting at 688, meaning that there's still room for improvement down the line. Okay, but now that we have her build out of the way, let's get into the most important part of the video, how much she actually increases the damage of her fellow cryo teammates. When looking at these damage numbers, it's actually pretty important to keep in mind that it doesn't actually matter what the damage numbers are, but rather how much she increases them from their original number. This is because everyone's account is completely different and everyone's going to have different numbers based off of how invested their characters are, so that's why we're going to be focusing on the damage increased rather than the actual number themselves. Let's go ahead and start with everyone's favorite nephew, Chongyun. When I cast Chongyun's skill, it hits for about 10,000 damage, and when I cast his burst, each one of the swords hits for about 11,000 damage. However, after Shenhe presses her skill and activates her burst, Chongyun's skill is now hitting for 20,600, and his burst swords are now hitting for 22,400. Essentially, just by adding Shenhe into the rotation, Chongyun's skill and burst were doubled. In my personal opinion, this is pretty impressive. However, do keep in mind that after he uses his skill and burst in quick succession like this, he does use up all of his quills, and thus the rest of Chongyun's damage will no longer be affected by her skill but only her burst. Alright, now let's take a look at Ganyu. I know that a lot of people are going to be interested in this one considering that she's about to be on rate up. It's really no surprise that Ganyu hits pretty hard all on her own. My Ganyu's balloon damage is doing about 34,000 damage without any external buffs. However, when we use Shenhe's hold skill, followed by her burst, Ganyu is now hitting for an impressive 53,000 damage. Now while this didn't double her damage, this is still very impressive. It isn't quite as strong as melt damage, but it's definitely nothing to sneeze at. And next up we have another fan favorite, Ayaka. Now Ayaka's actually pretty interesting, because as you'll see from the clip, she does about 11,000 damage per tick, but when we add Shenhe into the mix, she's doing about 27,000 damage. This is an insane boost considering how fast these tick. However, I do want to point out that these are using up the first 7 stacks, and if Ayaka didn't defeat this enemy within this time frame, then the damage would have reduced after those first 7 hits. Now this isn't a huge problem for Ayaka since she can obliterate enemies pretty quickly, but that's just something to keep in mind. My current thought is that they actually added the stacks specifically for Ayaka, because if she could maintain these stacks throughout her entire burst, it would be absolutely broken. Okay, and last but not least, out of the main DPSs that I personally tested is Eula. I know that a lot of people were asking about her in my last video, and so I wanted to see just how much she improved her damage. On her own, Eula did about 360,000 damage, but when we added Shenhe into the mix, we actually got around 420,000 damage. However, there is one thing that I do want to point out. When testing Eula, it's often very hard to tell just how many stacks you actually got on her burst. So I get the sneaking suspicion that I actually got an extra hit in there somewhere, but even still, it is a decent buff, it's just not astronomical. It's not doubling her damage like it did for cryo damage dealers. Also, one thing that I do want to point out is I actually tested out Eula a few different times, and I have to say that Shenhe and Eula actually don't have very good overlap with each other, mainly because Eula has such a long burst window, and Shenhe's buffs don't actually last that long, meaning that if you mess up your timings, it's actually very easy not to get the buffs. So that's something to consider if you are planning on using Shenhe with Eula. Okay, and these single target damage showcases are good and all, but what about when we actually put them into the heat of battle? I took a few of my strongest teams into Spiral Abyss just to see what would happen, and honestly I was pretty shocked at how well they performed. My teams and clears were actually already pretty good, but adding Shenhe into the mix and her total damage multipliers gave me some of the fastest clears I've ever gotten in Spiral Abyss. However, I do want to harp on the fact that it did take me a little while to get used to these rotations, and since my Shenhe actually has very low energy recharge, I had to focus way more on my rotations in order to make sure that I could consistently get up her buffs. But as you'll see in these clips, when everything does go right, it goes very right. This is the highest my damage has ever been on a freeze team, and it's all just because I added Shenhe into the mix. However, this wasn't actually the case on my Eula team. In fact, I actually didn't notice much of a difference between my standard clears and my clears with Shenhe. Perhaps this was due to bad rotations, and the fact that both Eula and Shenhe were extremely energy hungry, but like I said, I didn't actually notice that much of a difference as opposed to playing with a character like Zhongli instead, or even C6 Rosaria. This doesn't mean that she's bad by any means, but I do think that it means that she's not essential to a Eula comp. I also did try out triple cryo, and it worked really well. The overall damage was really solid, and I noticed my energy issues a lot less. However, I did notice with characters like Ayaka specifically, when I wasn't freezing enemies in place, I ended up losing out a lot of damage, strictly because the enemies kept moving out of the way of her burst. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to play her with a Hydro unit, but it definitely made things a lot easier for me. Whew, so we made it through the majority of testing now, but now I want to get into whether or not you should actually summon for Shenhe. Okay, real talk, I'm gonna break character for a little bit. I think that Shenhe is an absolutely amazing unit when you're pairing her with cryo characters, but currently that's about it. If you already have characters like Ganyu and Ayaka, or if you're planning on getting these characters down the line, then I think that Shenhe is almost a must summon. She isn't, I mean, no character in Genshin Impact is a must summon, but if you want to maximize their damage, then I think that Shenhe is definitely the best unit in the game for these characters specifically. However, if you aren't planning on summoning for either Ganyu or Ayaka, I think she's a hard skip. And there's a couple reasons why I'm saying she's a hard skip. Number one, we already have characters like Bennett in the game. Bennett is a 4-star, so he's much easier to get and much easier to get his constellations for, and overall you can use him in way more team comps. And if you watched my video, then you'll also notice that Kazuha was in my strongest teams almost every time. Kazuha does pair very well with Shenhe, and that's why my damage was really skyrocketing, because both of these units were essentially playing off of each other and buffing each other and the rest of their team. But Kazuha actually has a huge advantage over Shenhe, and it's simply that he's a Nemo. This means that he works well on cryo teams, hydro teams, pyro teams, and electro teams. The only teams that he doesn't really work well with are Geo teams, but honestly that's a really small price to pay for being so universal. Shenhe doesn't have this advantage, and she's really only good with cryo characters. And I mean, she is a decent physical support as well, but she's definitely not game changing in my personal opinion. On top of this, Shenhe is not friendly to new players at all. Although she's from Liyue and the majority of her Ascension materials are in Liyue/Mondstadt, her level Ascension materials as well as her talent materials are both located in Inazuma. And not at the beginning of Inazuma, like at the end of Inazuma. You can only reach Economia once you've completed a lot of the main storyline, and even once you get there, you still have to complete an entire quest in order to access her boss materials. This means if you're still in the early game, that you might not be able to get her over level 40 for a very long time. Weeks to months depending on how fast you're playing. Thus, I really just don't think it's a smart idea for new players to go for her when we have other rerun banner characters who are much more accessible and will offer more to new players where they are in the game. Whew, well, okay, I ragged on her enough, but this does not mean by any means that I think she's a bad character. I think she's a phenomenal character. I just think that she's too niche for me to personally recommend to the majority of the player base. If you're a proud cryo main, then definitely pick her up, you won't regret it, but if you aren't interested in cryo or cryo characters, then she's a hard skip. This might change down the line, but if that ends up being the case, you can always pick her up on her next rerun. So my overall rating is very solid, but very niche. Alright, but that's all that I have for today. However, if you're still stuck on who you want to summon for, I did make some Are They Worth It videos for both Xiao and Ganyu, which I'll link down below if you want to go check them out. I'm also still planning on covering Zhongli pretty soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that as well. And if you did end up enjoying this video, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. This one did take a lot out of me since I did have to blow through all of Economia pretty quickly in order to get to the boss, so I would definitely appreciate the support. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content from me, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. I'd love to have you along for the ride. But that's all for now, so until next time, best wishes. Bye!